from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kaylee Lines.
The White House prepares to pull back the tariffs. Welcome to the Friday edition as the administration is set to lower tariffs with new exemptions on everything from bananas to beef as food prices continue to rise for consumers. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall in for Kaylee Lines today, live from Washington. Thank you for being with us on the Friday edition here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're going to get the view from an economist here, Tyler, when we talk to Stuart Paul at Bloomberg Economics, who sees things a bit differently than the administration.
Right. Well, we're going to look into the data and see how potentially these tariffs are being passed through, because clearly the administration is trying to take steps to ease the high cost burden on Americans. And it's interesting because when you look at what the USTR is outlining, he's talking about these items that don't come so easily in the U.S.
Yes,
you can't grow them here. Bananas, cocoa, because the majority of this administration's tariffs, Joe, have to do with boosting domestic manufacturing. And you can't really quite do that with some of the things listed on.
How true. Don't mention the avocado toast. There's a lot more where that came from. I'm still waiting for them to get to the wine, but that's a whole different story here. We're going to look at what tariffs are being discussed, but also what's behind this move. Tyler, we talked to Peter Navarro last night, who, like the statement out today from the White House, says this is still Joe Biden inflation and nothing to do with tariffs.
Right, exactly. Though he did tell us that the White House understands that inflation is hitting the MAGA base, in his words. I pulled up the last CPI report for September, which showed that food prices are up 3.2% year over year. But of course, we've been without data for the last few weeks amid the government shutdown. So we'll have to see how this ultimately shakes out.
Well, this whole inflation talk is not helping expectations for the Fed, which are not helping Wall Street today.
Nope, that's definitely having an impact on the market. So for a look at the Friday trade, we head now to Amy Morris here with us in Washington for the latest. Hey, Amy.
Hey, Tyler, you're absolutely right. But Wall Street has erased some of those early losses with a tech share resurgence led by Tesla, which is up about 2%. We do check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 now up about 0.2%. NASDAQ up about 0.4%. And the Dow is still down about 0.4%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.14% and the 2-year yield at 3.6%. Bitcoin, check it out. It's still sliding below that $100,000 mark, well below it at this point, now down more than 3%, hovering around 95,700. Sedara shares are 106% higher after Merck agreed to acquire the therapeutics company for about $9.2 billion. Merck is looking to expand its portfolio of treatments because the patents are expiring for a lot of its drugs in the next few years, including its most popular drug, Keytruda. Kansas City Fed President Jeff Schmidt says more rate cuts could actually drive inflation pressures. Schmidt said during an event in Denver that more cuts could have longer lasting impact on inflation while not doing much to help shore up the labor market. That also sort of kept stocks lower. The U.S. and Switzerland have now reached a preliminary trade agreement to lower tariffs on many Swiss goods, including watches, Joe, from 39% to 15% in exchange for the tariff reduction. Switzerland has committed to investing in the U.S., including $200 billion during Trump's term, and will grant the U.S. duty-free bilateral tariff quotas on certain agricultural products. And Greer says the White House will unveil fresh tariff exemptions to address high food prices. That announcement coming later today. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. We go back to Balance of Power now with Joe Mathieu and Tyler Kendall.
All right, Amy, thanks so much. As Amy mentioned, I'm Tyler Kendall here in Washington alongside Joe Mathieu, and today is a big tariff day, as you just heard Amy outline. The USTR announcing that there's going to be a deal with Switzerland. This is a big deal because it is going to lower tariffs from 39% to 15%. We also saw the administration ink some framework agreements earlier today with Argentina, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Ecuador. And then we are expecting these other carve-outs, Joe, when it comes to key products that you can't make so easily here in the U.S., all part of the administration's bid to help lower prices. As we know, affordability is coming up time and time again with American voters.
Certainly at the grocery store, the president has talked about that. Food prices, specifically beef. That's why we're apparently importing Argentinian beef. But there are going to be carve-outs on everything from beef, cocoa, bananas, a lot of the stuff that you simply can't grow here. And I wonder if that extends at some point here, Tyler, to other products. What about cerveza? What about you can't make Mexican beer in the United States? There are different things that could pop up, and they've really tried to seize on the idea of flexibility. Greer talked about that this morning, that this was always part of the plan, that when pressure points arrived, the administration would take action, and we seem to be doing that now.
Right, and this actually stems from an executive order that we saw President Trump sign a few months ago, calling for the USTR and the Commerce Department to look into those areas where there could be these exemptions. But it's been really interesting to track all of the tariff policies from the beginning of the administration, because, of course, when these were all originally rolled out, we were told time and time again from officials that we weren't going to see carve-outs. But, of course, this is a living, breathing policy as we know it, and it has shifted time and time again, and this is just the latest contour.
It's Taco Friday once again down here, Tyler. We talked about this with Peter Navarro, as a matter of fact. I don't know if that's something we can spin back, because it's interesting, Tyler, when we talk about tariffs, that's not the same conversation that the administration is having with the impact on prices. They say that's Joe Biden.
No, exactly. Actually, I think we do have that tape. We want to bring you a little bit of our conversation with Peter Navarro, asking him about the recent polling, the recent consumer sentiment numbers, that inflation is weighing on the American consumer.
President Trump viscerally understands the pain many Americans are going through because of the inflation issue, and a lot of that pain is centered on our MAGA base, and we understand that. What we have to do as an administration is first of all, be crystal clear about the sources of the inflation.
The sources of the inflation are up for debate still. And that's why we turn to Stuart Paul for his insights. U.S. economist at Bloomberg Economics with us from world headquarters in New York. We've identified the pain here, Stuart. It doesn't seem everybody agrees on why.
It doesn't seem like everybody agrees on why, but when we do our decomposition of some of the drivers of inflation, we find that about 25% of the cost of tariffs are being passed through to consumer prices, as per the September CPI report. We're still waiting on October, of course, but with the latest data that we have, it does look like consumers are feeling some of the effects of tariffs. And so we can't say that this is all Biden inflation, as Peter Navarro suggested. I also do want to congratulate the two of you on an absolutely fabulous interview with Peter Navarro on the late edition of Balance of Power just last night, when he suggested that Chairman Powell should commit seppuku, the Japanese honor suicide, for failing to address inflation. Oh, my goodness. And yes, all of our viewers and listeners around the world should go back and watch yesterday's late edition of Balance of Power.
I didn't pursue the Japan reference in that conversation.
No.
But maybe we should have.
Yeah, well, we thank you for that, Stuart. And actually, I get to give you a shout out now, because I always ask Stuart Paul questions off the air, and now I get to ask him questions on the air. But if we stick with tariffs, I'm wondering, Stuart, if you can give us any sort of idea on how quickly these tariff exemptions could actually work their way through the economy. When you hear the administration saying that they're going to issue these carve-outs, what sort of impact will Americans actually feel? How long will it take for those prices to come down?
Well, for certain imports that are very difficult for us to produce domestically, the items that are difficult for us to produce domestically, the effect should be relatively quick. It should be relatively easy for Argentina, for example, to direct some additional exports, goods that they're producing, to the United States. But when we look at the actual aggregates, the volumes that are coming from places like Argentina, El Salvador, Ecuador, Guatemala, it really doesn't matter very much. For example, about 1.5% of our beef imports come from Argentina. We get about 5 times that much from Brazil. We import about 20 times as much coffee from Brazil as we do from Argentina. So when we think about negotiating new trade deals, particularly with Latin America, and if the administration is trying to bring down the cost of everyday goods and services, goods and really agriculture goods in particular, the ball game is really negotiating a deal with Brazil, Argentina, Guatemala, El Salvador, Ecuador. It's not going to have much of a material impact. This is more a matter of politics and recognizing that addressing things like cost of living and affordability is a winning political issue, as we saw in the New York mayoral election.
Well, then I'm really confused here, Stuart. If it doesn't pull prices lower, because it's almost a tacit endorsement of the idea that tariffs are inflationary by acknowledging this and announcing the exception. If it doesn't pull prices lower, what's the point?
It's at least good optics, and I think that we are finally at the point where the administration is realizing that one of the primary issues that the administration was elected on was addressing inflation. With disinflation stalling out and headline CPI inflation remaining around 3%, they're going to need to get to a more tactical approach to addressing the inflation problem and really responding to the issues that they were elected to address. And so at this point, yes, there's going to need to be a little bit of a walk back on some of the promises around tariffs. And it's not the worst thing in the world to announce trade deals as we head into 2026 and the midterm elections.
All right. Stuart Paul, Bloomberg Economics, U.S. economist, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. And we want to stick on a domestic politics, but shift over from the White House to Capitol Hill. Now, yesterday on Balance of Power, Joe and I spoke with the newly sworn-in Congresswoman Adelita Grijalva of Arizona. It had taken her, at that point, weeks to get sworn into office while the U.S. government was shut down. But one of the first things that she did once she was sworn in was she became the 218th signature on a discharge petition that could force a vote to release the Epstein files from the Department of Justice. We asked her about her signature on that petition and the timeline we could be looking at yesterday on Balance of Power.
I hope that it passes the House without any issue and that the pressure then goes to senators, because regardless of who is implicated, no one should want the label of protecting pedophiles. And, I talked to some survivors today, and I said, one of the things that I would do is go and target your senators, talk to them about why it's important for them to show unity in this, and then go and call some of their constituents and make sure that there's a connection there.
Adelita Grijalva, the new Congresswoman from Arizona, joining us yesterday on Balance of Power. And we want to extend the conversation and bring in Barbara Comstock, former Republican Congresswoman from Virginia. Congresswoman, thanks so much for joining us here. I'm just wondering what you make about what has been Republican strategy so far when it comes to the Epstein files. President Trump did campaign on releasing them, but at this point, that doesn't seem to be the White House's position now. How should have Republicans been playing this?
Well, it's been an absolute disaster for Republicans. I mean, to shut down the House of Representatives for all these weeks, the longest government shutdown, but the House being out of session all this time, has been a disaster for Republicans. So when they open up, they will have bipartisan support. Congressman Massey, a Republican, along with Ro Khanna, has led that discharge petition. So they now have the votes. And I do imagine there will be quite a few Republicans who will join on that. I know Congressman Don Bacon, a Republican, and others have already said that they will vote for that. And given that Republicans, including when I was in Congress, I worked on human trafficking legislation and passed bills, and there are a lot of Republicans who did. Many Republicans who supported legislation like that will look very hypocritical if they don't support this measure now to release the Epstein files, when so many of them already did support that. And given that the Epstein estate has these files, and certainly it seems that they are willing to put more and more of those files out. So it will be foolish if the congressman, after you saw what happened in Virginia and New Jersey and in all of these special elections, if after Republicans have been out there on the record all the way up to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance themselves have said, hey, why don't we release these files? What are they hiding? And we've already seen a lot of the information in those files. They need to get quickly down there to the floor and say they are for releasing these files.
Well, we understand we could see, Congresswoman, 40 to 50 Republicans vote in the House. But this is, at the moment, at least, going nowhere in the Senate. Even if this does pass the House, what does John Thune do?
Well, if you're a third of those Republicans who are going to be up for election, again, many of those who have harped on this issue for years, you do not want to have ads run against you being a pedophile protector. That is not going to be a story to have Jeffrey Epstein, pictures in those ads against you. And you do not want to have these victims who are very strong advocates for themselves showing up in ads saying, here's what he said before the election that they should be released. Now here's what they're saying after. And this is something that the MAGA base themselves are not sympathetic on keeping these files under wraps. You're seeing MAGA flags in neighborhoods coming down because they want these files released. You have White House battles between and among people like Pam Bondi and Dan Bongino and the FBI director Kash Patel, who himself was on the air saying, why don't they put these files out there? So there's really no recourse to not letting these files, become public.
So this is a debate that has come up now that the government is reopened. Something up that is coming up because the government's reopened is the policy fight ahead when it comes to health care. And both sides of the aisle have said that they are willing to negotiate and that something needs to be done when it comes to health care. From your time on the Hill, do you think it's viable that we could see a deal by January 30th, which is that next looming deadline, that we could get a potentially another government shutdown?
I certainly hope not. I mean, people have suffered. I mean, during this shutdown, that's why you should move on from things like the Epstein files, because they need to be focusing on good policy. And you've had a bipartisan coalition come together to say they do want to find a solution, because you have people right now, people who are cancer victims, people with Alzheimer's, people, who are farmers who are on these exchanges, people who are pregnant saying, hey, I'm 6 or 7 months pregnant. I'm not due until next year, but my premiums are going from $500 a month to $2,000 or $3,000 a month. Congressman Bacon, again, a Republican, Congressman Jeff Van Drew, a Republican, has said, we are crazy if we don't come up with a solution for this. These frontline Republicans who are now, they've looked at the results in Virginia and New Jersey, and they realize if they don't pass some kind of solution, as Jeff Van Drew said, it's the moral right thing to do, but it's the politically right thing to do. If we don't pass a solution, we are going to get politically slaughtered next year. And they are right.
Wow. Great to have you back. Barbara Comstock, former Republican Congresswoman from Virginia. It's good to see you. Thanks for being part of our conversation today, as always, on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington. With our eyes on Wall Street, Tyler, we've seen the markets pull well off their lows of the session, having had another dramatically lower start to trading following steep losses yesterday that saw the S&P 500 down over 1.5%, the NASDAQ down even more than that. The S&P has turned positive. It's up 0.25%. The NASDAQ has turned positive as well, up 0.5%. The Dow has trimmed losses significantly. There does seem to be a bout of bottom fishing here and buying the dip once again on Wall Street, Tyler.
Right, exactly. We also have our eyes on those Fed speakers appearing to perhaps urge caution when it comes to bets on further policy easing ahead of the next FOMC, which we will keep our eyes on.
We sure will. Bitcoin beginning to rebound from its lows as well, but still down just around $96,000. The VIX at 20. We'll assemble our panel next, only here on Bloomberg.
We got an announcement from the White House earlier today, the USTR saying that we could see some tariff exemptions when it comes to key food items that are hard to produce in the U.S., like cocoa and coffee. Joe, the headline on the Bloomberg terminal reading, U.S. to unveil tariff exclusions as voters rage over food costs.
Once again, back to the scenario in which we put on a really tight pair of shoes and feel really good when we take them off. Of course, if you talk to the White House, and we talked to Peter Navarro yesterday about this, he will tell you that the inflation is actually stemming from Biden economic policies. But there has to be some sort of acknowledgement here, a tacit acknowledgement, at least, that tariffs are involved if they're being removed to lower prices, right?
Right. It feels like that. And we really have seen the White House refocus, I think is a fair way to put it, in the wake of last Tuesday's elections, where Republicans saw losses because of this focus on affordability. And then after that, we saw a lot of proposals from this White House, Joe, from the 50-year mortgage to $2,000 tariff refund rebate checks. It seems like there has been a refocusing here on those sorts of policies.
Yeah, that 50-year mortgage idea does not seem to be catching on. But it's where we start our conversation with our great panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us today. Jeanne is our Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick is our Republican strategist, partner at Stonecourt Capital. What do you make of this, Jeanne, and even the rhetoric that surrounds this? Now we're talking about affordability. During the Biden administration, it was just inflation. We just rip off the Band-Aid and hit them between the eyes. Now it's about affordability and costs, which are the terms that resonate in focus groups when you talk to consumers about this stuff and may not be economists. It's all the same issue, though. And if the White House is exempting certain products here when it comes to tariffs, is that not an acknowledgement that tariffs are inflationary?
Yeah, I mean, I think the administration, Donald Trump, everybody working for him, they read the Bloomberg Harris poll. They saw that he is, 18 points underwater on the economy. Only just a third of Americans say we're moving in the right direction on the economy. So they are seeing that religion. I think the big question here is, as much as people like Navarro and others may recognize that, does Donald Trump indeed follow suit? And I'm just looking, Joe and Tyler, at Truth Social, and his last post is about Jeffrey Epstein. And this has been a consistent problem with Donald Trump. We go right back to the election. We all remember his advisors were very anxious that he talk about costs. So they set up groceries and stuff on a table, and they told him to go out and talk about it. And if you guys recall, he literally went out and said, they want me to talk about this. It's incredibly boring. He went through and did it. And then he moved on to what he wanted to talk about. And we sort of see that over and over again. So while voters are absolutely raging, and we saw that on the election night about costs, the question is, can Trump stick to the narrative coming out of the White House now? And I think that's an open question.
Right, Rick, what's your take here? Is this a messaging problem? Because we've also heard from officials that it will take time for the administration's full policies to work their way through the economy and to, give it a little bit of patience. But I'm wondering how much patience American voters do have as we, of course, gear up to the midterms next year.
Yeah, I'd say there are sort of two components to this from the messaging I'm seeing from the Trump administration. One is a real pivot away from this idea that affordability is a joke or somehow it's a scam. They're now embracing affordability and want to talk about what they've done in that regard. And there are some stories they can tell that will resonate with consumers. And then the second half of that story is trying to recast tariffs not as weapons to secure our financial freedom, but ways to actually bring down costs to consumers. And we haven't heard that really from them before. I mean, these were all been sort of punitive measures on unfair trading partners or ways for Donald Trump to get negotiations, all of which he basically has to have the support of the American consumer in order to do all that stuff. Well, that kind of is starting to fall apart. We don't have to go far from the latest Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, which is one of its lowest levels in history. And so they're losing that fight. In this way, they come out, in Peter Navarro interview with you, clearly he was trying to recast trade as something that will help bring down these high costs, in his case, borne by consumers because of the Biden inflation. But nonetheless, they are tools in the toolkit to try and make things cost less. We all laughed about banana tariffs when they were put on, thinking, what are we going to do? Go out and create a tropical zone in the United States to grow bananas? So it wasn't long before that taco trade was going to come through, and now we've got it.
Banana taco. Jeanne, Adam on the terminal reminds us of what Howard Lutnick said on March 21st, 2025. Said the fourth quarter for sure is Trump's and maybe shades of the third, referring to when this would become Trump's economy. Remember that we spent the first half of the year saying that's Biden data. But with that in mind, I look at the news release and the statement out today from the White House. It says President Donald J. Trump inherited an economic mess when he took office. Years of mismanagement under Biden, his incompetent administration, and Democrats in Congress brought the country to the brink of economic ruin. The message here is we'll keep working to make sure everyone benefits. Is this still Joe Biden's economy?
Adam is 1,000% right. Howard Lutnick said it. Also, Scott Bessent said it. If I remember correctly, it was in one of his early speeches. He said, by November, by Thanksgiving, essentially, this will be Trump's economy and we'll all be swinging Dixie. He didn't say that. I said that. But the idea was that they were going to blame Joe Biden for, 10 months, 11 months, and then Trump would own this thing. But now, of course, they need to push that back. And again, I do think we see a big split in the administration because they do recognize the signs that are, flashing red on this economy. Rick's favorite, consumer sentiment, the election, poll numbers like the Harris Bloomberg poll, all of these things. And yet they are dealing with a president who is committed, to use your metaphor, Joe, to keeping those tight shoes on. And so how then do you handle that? So I think we see a White House almost at odds with itself. And again, just look at Truth Social. He wants to talk about Jeffrey Epstein. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to do a lot of things, but he doesn't want to talk about this economy and costs because he knows it's a loser for him. And that's really where we find ourselves today. I think the administration is going to try to pull him along, but it's going to be tough.
Well, we also wanted to turn to some other issues that are brewing in the House. Next week, lawmakers are going to tee up a discussion on a potential stock trading ban for themselves. Now, Joe, Mathieu, earlier this week, sat down with Congressman Brian Stile, a Republican from Wisconsin, and asked him about what this could actually look like. Take a listen.
We want to make sure that no members of Congress are profiting from insider information. I think that is imperative and incredibly important for the American people. We're going to be having a hearing looking at what is currently occurring and whether or not reforms are needed. But I think we have a huge opportunity to make sure that no member of Congress, no elected official, is leveraging inside information to their financial benefit.
Rick, you just heard the congressman there call this a huge opportunity. How much does this have to do with optics, restoring trust with the American people versus the tangible policy that we could see actually come out of a hearing such as this one?
Yeah, I think that this is a debate that's been going on for a long time and is long overdue. Typically, in order to get something like this passed through Congress, you have to have a scandal. You have to have an egregious effort on the part of a congressman or woman to, do insider training and then get caught. And they're like, oh, my God, we've got to reform this process. So the fact that this is coming up in a relatively benign environment, yes, the American public is questioning, Congress and whether or not they're really doing their job. Longest government shutdown in history will actually add flame to that fire. But I think it's also one of these things that there is so much non-public information available to members of Congress and their staffs that they've got to start being very responsible about it. And the optics of trading off of that information, of having it in their possession and using it to make a trade is, I think, for most Americans, outrageous. And so maybe this just hits the outrageous factor. Finally, and something's going to get done about it.
Well, it seems like Rick Scott is outraged. The Republican senator from Florida was involved in a hearing on this back in the summer. This is Rick Scott in July 30th. Jeanne, listen to what the senator said about why this might be a bad idea.
Now, in this job, I don't trade stocks. I don't own operating businesses. But somehow it's suspect because I made money. I don't know how many people in the audience, how many of you don't want to make money? Anybody want to be poor? I don't.
Jeanne, you want to be poor?
Please no, Joe Mathieu, please no. What I don't want is for Americans to be waking up and looking at decisions made by their government and wondering if those decisions were made to benefit the individual congressperson or the president, or if they were made in the best interest of the American public. Rick is right, our Rick Davis, that this is an old problem. But I call them ours. But there are solutions. And one of those solutions is you can't trade individual stocks. You want in on the market, get on indexed funds, right? As long as you are in office. So there are answers to this. But the reality is we've seen on the Democrat and Republican side, people who have been enriching themselves, and they have been doing so while in office. And that is incredibly problematic and not helped by the fact that we have a president who, if you buy his crypto, invest in his crypto company, then you maybe can go ask for a pardon or go ask for something you need. It is bad for democracy. It is bad for us. And again, we shouldn't have to wake up and wonder why decisions to go to war are being made. And I'm sorry, Rick Scott, but that's what you're doing there. You are making big decisions about our lives. You want in on the market, go in a safer way where you are as blind as all of us are who go in.
All right, our political panel today, both Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Thank you both, as always. And stick with us here on Balance of Power, because we're going to turn from domestic to foreign politics. Look at what's happening in Venezuela with Michael Allen, Managing Director of Beacon Global Strategies. I'm Tyler Kendall, here alongside Joe Mathieu, and this is Bloomberg. As we saw relief brought by the end of the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, but then it quickly gave way to some volatility this week. But today we're now seeing a reversal of the slump we saw earlier in the session. So to get into all of it, we're going to bring in Bloomberg Television's markets correspondent Norah Mulinda, who joins us now from World Headquarters in New York. Norah, what's driving this change?
Well, you're clearly seeing a lot of uncertainty in the market, Tyler, as you just called out, a lot of volatility. Traders are really trying to see what the Federal Reserve is going to do next. At first, we were thinking that there would be potentially a cut here in December, but now concepts about this and the thoughts on this are changing a tiny bit here. So you were seeing a lot of people selling off tech. That was the worst performing sector in the S&P 500. But now if you take a look, it's actually among the best performing sectors in the S&P 500. So you're really seeing a lot of investors trying to figure out where to be in this market. And clearly, it seems as though people are still continuing to bet on tech, AI, and all the sort.
That didn't take long, Norah. What brings the buyers back so quickly? It was all doom and gloom when I woke up this morning.
Tell me about it. I mean, if we think about the NASDAQ 100, it fell more than 2% at yesterday's closing bell. So it is interesting to now see a lot of the tech shares and everything rising here. We're seeing investors coming back in the market. We're clearly seeing risk on being the mood once again today.
Is crypto the exception? What's going on with Bitcoin entering bear territory here? If you look at that chart, it slipped below all the important moving averages, and for $100,000 seems like a long time ago.
Tell me about it. I mean, $100,000 was a level a lot of people were seeing as a key metric, but we are seeing some weakness there. We did see Bitcoin falling with a lot of the other riskier assets, especially if you look at tech and how it was pulling back earlier in the session. So you are seeing Bitcoin really being hit. Of course, this is really a speculative space to be, so it's not surprising that when you see a broad-based risk-off sentiment, that move there, you're also going to see Bitcoin falling off of that.
Norah, shares of Walmart are also in focus today. Can you just talk about what's playing out as we're seeing the trade progress?
Absolutely. So we are seeing Walmart in focus. We are seeing shares a bit lower right now, but this is after we did get news that the CEO is retiring. He will retire in February and be replaced by U.S. head John Furner here. So we are seeing a lot of people really trying to digest what this means for Walmart more broadly. But of course, it is interesting because if we look at Walmart, it's like the biggest employer here on the private space for U.S. consumers here. So it's going to be interesting, especially as we do get results out of Walmart next week, as we get a broader read here on the retailer.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting to see that stock fall off the lows as well, Norah. This is the man who's been running U.S. operations for Walmart, so it seems like he might know a little bit about the company. Norah Mulinda in New York. Happy Friday, Norah, and thank you for the insights in this market that we're watching evolve before our eyes here. Pretty amazing. Music is playing loudly from the sound system in the Rose Garden Club. We just got a pool report from the White House. Haven't seen the president yet today, but it's blaring out of the Rose Garden and heard from the lower press office. Tunes from Phantom of the Opera and other Trump favorites. Colleagues reporting as well, hearing It's a Man's World by James Brown. So something's cooking at the White House, and we haven't seen the Marine Guard in front of the West Wing yet. The president's been truthing from upstairs in the residence, and we wonder, Tyler, if there's much truth to the reporting here. CBS told us yesterday that the president has been presented with options for a strike against Venezuela as soon as this weekend.
Right, exactly. It's something that we're going to be watching closely, as we've actually seen Maduro, the leader there, take some of his own preemptive measures. He bolstered some of the country's defenses yesterday and was urging Venezuelans to actually spy on their neighbors in case they saw any activity related to the U.S. in the region.
Quite a development here, as we had already reported weeks ago, and the president acknowledged a CIA ground operation, a covert operation was underway in Venezuela. And just about 2 days ago, the USS Jerry Ford Carrier Strike Group arrived in the theater, leading many to wonder, appropriately, what's about to come next. And that's why we thought we'd sit down with Michael Allen, back with us here in studio, Managing Director of Beacon Global Strategies, and a veteran of the White House and former Special Assistant to President George W. Bush in the national security sector. Michael, welcome back. It's great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Last time we spoke, this flotilla was being assembled, and we've been picking off now, I think, 20 different boats, alleged drug trafficking boats coming out of Venezuela and others out of Colombia. Are we about to go to war in the Caribbean?
It sure feels like it. We have set the theater with a lot of firepower, and I think the president probably is going through a range of options, everything from, at the very top, air plus ground, heavy air, and then maybe something that's lighter with sort of regime targets and or drug facilities. So I think he's probably got a range of targets here. I don't think he's going to go on the ground, but then that raises the question of why do it? Because I don't think he's really going to achieve regime change by doing it, and there are not that many cartel targets.
That actually tracks exactly with what our analysts at Bloomberg Economics are tracking as well. They say that the U.S. would likely target government-operated air defenses at the beginning of a potential strike campaign to reduce any potential threat to American pilots operating in foreign airspace. What are some of those tactical challenges, part of that calculus that the administration has to make when it's thinking about how it could potentially strike a country like this?
Well, it reminds me of the Israeli action into Iran. The first thing they do is knock out enemy air defenses so that they can get air superiority all over the country to fly with complete impunity and go as long as they need to be able to go in order to hit all of the targets that they have. The issue here is that I don't think we've been staring at Venezuela like we do other countries and developing target sets for very long. This is a project that the intelligence community engages in. I really wonder how many targets we have to prosecute here and ultimately what happens. Of course, we all want to see Maduro go, but it's really hard to achieve those sort of aims by an air campaign alone.
Why Venezuela and not Colombia, if that's where the lion's share of cocaine is coming from in South America, or Mexico for that matter? Or should I ask a different question? Is this going to be a playbook for all of those?
Well, he's definitely had a lot of negative things to say about Colombia of late.
Sure has.
I think Venezuela is probably the easiest of the three because Maduro is such a rogue operator and he has deep relationships with all of our adversaries. The country is in absolute shambles. There's so many migration that's destabilized the region. And of course, many have come to the United States. So I think that's probably at the very, very top of what the president is worried about.
Energy comes into a lot of what this administration thinks about. Energy prices, the oil market. We know that there could be some pretty broad ranging consequences depending on how the U.S. depends to act towards Venezuela. How have we seen that issue, energy, actually provide leverage to either side as we're looking ahead to these potential consequences?
Well, I think the United States has proven, just like we did on Iran sanctions, that if we levy sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, it is going to be impactful. It is going to continue to knock their oil capability offline. So I think we have them in a sanctions vice grip there, and I think people are very interested in, over time, having oil bring the Venezuelan economy back to sort of substantial levels, subsistence levels, but I think they believe they need to get past the Maduro regime before they're able to do that.
Talk to us about this platform that is the carrier strike group that just arrived, because this is massive firepower, Michael. This is the biggest aircraft carrier in the world, and it brings with it an entire flotilla. Of course, all the fighter jets, the personnel. You've got 5,000 sailors that just steamed into the Caribbean here. It seems like we could have done this with a lot of cruise missiles, drone technology, assets we already have in theater, maybe a submarine. Why do we need all of this hardware?
So one thing they may be thinking of and discussing among their options is, how do I intimidate Maduro into, and maybe there's an intermediary that's going to go there at some point and say, here's what we need out of you. We need you to step down. We'll make sure that you have protection in some other third-party location, and otherwise intimidate him and compel him to leave. And so that may be what we're doing here, which is using military force to back up our diplomacy.
So that's U.S. military force. Are we working at all with our allies on this? How does an operation like this, work when it could be such a significant escalation? What do those talks look like behind the scenes, those back channel talks?
Yeah, I think that we're probably talking to a lot of people in the region, but we don't have anybody, I think, that's going to pair up with us to prosecute this particular set of targets. There aren't a lot of military capabilities down there in the Western Hemisphere. We've read about certain of our intelligence cooperation partners not sharing intelligence with us because they don't want us to go after and blow up any more drug boats if it's unclear of their origin. So I think we're a little bit on our own here, but we have the firepower, and they really don't have any military to fight back to speak of.
You mentioned Israel and Iran, which is something we talked about a lot around the time of those strikes with you. There is reporting that Iran is very quietly rebuilding its nuclear capability. What are you hearing?
I think they are. I think it's inevitable. I think it's in the DNA of this particular regime. The big question, the big intelligence question after the strike is, where is the LEU? Was it destroyed in the strike? Was it buried? Was it diverted? Or are they digging it out? And I think that is of grave concern to the Israelis. It is us as well. I still think it was a success that we were able to knock out a lot of these different locations, but we're really wondering where this HEU is, and what if they're
highly enriched
uranium, and what if there are other sites that we were not aware of that'll either be centrifuge halls, or maybe they were even storage of centrifuges that they would bring online one day. So there's a lot of intelligence work that's got to be done, and I have no doubt the Israelis and the United States are all over it.
Yeah, what do those efforts look like to actually try to determine this? At this point, it's been months. Yeah. How much longer does it take to uncover something like this?
Well, we could get some assistance from the IAEA. We, the United States, have sort of unmatched capability from space. And the Israelis, of course, send actual agents into Iran. And they demonstrated that throughout Operation Midnight Hammer. And I don't doubt that they've activated all the networks they have of opposition groups and ethnic groups who are not friendly to the Iranian regime, and they're checking things out inside the country. So I think because it's such an acute national security issue for the Israelis in particular, that they're going to be the leader on trying to figure out what new capability the Iranians might have.
It's a good time to be a missile maker. Yeah. We've heard so much from our own analysis here at Bloomberg Intelligence from Colonel Wayne Sanders that there is about to be a buying frenzy, a massive block of orders coming in from the Pentagon to replace interceptors that we have given to the likes of Israel and Ukraine now for several years, and our own offensive capabilities that need to be maintained. What's coming for the likes of Lockheed, RTX, General Dynamics, and the rest?
I think things are looking up. I mean, if there was one thing that we realized swiftly at the beginning of the Ukraine campaign was that we were dangerously low on all sorts of munitions.
Have we made the changes in the manufacturing chain that are required?
We have begun to. There are a number of facilities around the country that have double-timed and triple-timed. I know this is a big focus for the Trump administration. The Deputy Secretary in particular has an initiative to up the spending quickly on different types of munitions, but we need it for the China fight. We need it to transfer to Taiwan so that we can deter China from invading. We need to be able to send some to the Ukrainians. And as you mentioned, we still have big interests in the Middle East. We still want the Israelis to have a lot of capability as well. So I can't think of many topics other than maybe shipbuilding and the rest that are going to get at Golden Dome that'll get as much attention and funding in the short to medium term.
Well, it's great to have you back for a conversation. Michael Allen, with a number of hotspots brewing around the country. Do you think there's action this weekend, just to be clear, in Venezuela?
I don't know. It feels too soon. Yeah. It feels like they're going to settle for some intelligence community work for a while, I think.
Well, it's good to get your read on this. From Beacon Global Strategies, Michael Allen, we thank you, as always, being with us here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington. We'll meet you back here 5 o'clock Eastern time for the late edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. With the president heading out of town soon, lawmakers, Tyler, are already gone.
Right. We're going to see if we get any late breaking news today. Be sure to check back in with us at 5 p.m. Eastern. Bloomberg Business Week Daily is up next. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.